So in my last video I introduced you all to Professor Douglas J. Amy, creator of the cringe fest known as GUBBERMINT.com. Well, it turns out his massive throbbing hard-on for bureaucracy doesn't end at the internet. It exists in the literary world as well, and in this video he's advertising his book. Let's take a look, shall we?
The title of my book is Government is Good. And obviously I don't mean necessarily that everything that government does is good.
Not that you'd be able to tell that by looking at his website. Heck, if a bureaucrat farts in his direction, he jumps for joy. As a matter of fact, interesting story, when I was 12, I wanted to be a fox for Halloween, so I went on Google, typed in fox costume, came across this picture. And this was the first time I ever got a really, hard, solid boner. I'd imagine Professor Amy here had a similar experience with government.
What I'm really arguing in this book is that government, as a democratic institution, is a very good thing for us.
Do you support mob rule, Professor Amy? Because democracy is mob rule by proxy.
Conservatives often argue that a lot of government programs are way too expensive.
Libertarians and conservatives aren't the same thing. Conservatives criticize government spending for political points, to rally support and further their own agenda. Libertarians criticize government spending out of principle. The fact that these same conservatives who complain about expensive government programs want to build a wall across the entire US-Mexico border should make this clear as day. Professor Amy fails to make the distinction between those who argue for smaller government for political gain and those who do so on the basis of fundamental principles. Now this is something you'd readily expect from the likes of Paula Dice and Bad Mouse, but this guy has a degree in political science. He should know the difference.
And really waste taxpayers' money.
Pretty much every government program wastes taxpayer money to some extent. A lot of programs flat out don't accomplish anything or even hurt people, such as the war on drugs and overseas aggression. But even those government programs that do actually benefit people usually still waste money because they're funded through coercion. There's no incentive to find any potential better or more efficient ways of providing the service.
But I would argue that in many cases, it's the opposite that's the case. That many government programs are incredibly good deals for taxpayers.
Well, that's just the catch. Because these programs are funded through coercion, there's no way for market signals to operate. There's no real way to know for sure whether or not they are a good deal. Even if you did feel like you were getting a good deal from government currently, if they decided to change the terms of the deal, you'd have no way of opting out.
I think a good example of this is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency.
Right, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're going to specifically focus on the good things the EPA does and filter out all the bad things they do. For example, using vaguely worded wetlands protection legislation to curtail property rights.
It costs us only as taxpayers about $30 each per year.
That's just the upfront tax burden. When you take into account the regulatory burden put on the market, the actual per capita amount each person spends on the EPA could be much higher.
To fund all of these programs that the EPA has. So, would you be better off having that money, in your own pocket, so maybe you could go buy a nice meal out, once? Or is it better to have that money being spent by the EPA on all of these programs to clean up the environment, to fight global warming, to clean up toxic waste, and all the things that they do?
Well, the short answer is we have no way of knowing. We don't actually have a choice, so there's no way for the market to determine which resource allocation would be optimal.
Now, unfortunately, most Americans don't really appreciate all the different ways that government programs help them.
You sure it's that, not the fact that they're forced to pay for all the ones that don't help them as well?
One study recently showed that 40% of the people who receive Social Security, unemployment insurance, and Medicare actually claim that they don't use government programs.
Well, if we libertarians had our way, they wouldn't have to. They could use IRAs, annuities, private insurance, charities, which are all not only more sustainable, but arguably better quality.
One of the reasons that people don't tend to notice all the things that they get from government, all the benefits they have from government programs, has to do with the sort of peculiar nature of what we get from government. Sometimes it's not so obvious. I mean, if we go out into the marketplace or go to a store and we buy something, we put down some money and what we get is very tangible. You buy a candy bar, you buy a shirt or whatever.
Did the store by chance threaten to kidnap you into a cage if you didn't buy the candy bar or t-shirt?
That's not often the case with government. You pay your taxes, But often what you get is not particularly tangible.
People purchase non-tangible things in the free market all the time. Insurance for like your house or your car or your health is a common example. The problem isn't that it's intangible, the problem is that it's based on coercion.
Think of it this way. A lot of what government does and a lot of what government programs are designed to do is to prevent bad things from happening to you.
The ironic thing about this is that a lot of these programs actually end up causing bad things to happen to you. Heck, even on its face, without looking into it at all, each one of these programs is backed by a gun. The government isn't suggesting that you pay into Social Security. They're not politely asking you not to grow weed on your own property or to share beer with people under 21.
Right. So we pay our taxes so that our houses don't get robbed.
So we're being robbed in order to not be robbed. Yeah, brilliant logic.
To that. The bridges don't fall down.
Interesting then how some of the worst bridge accidents in history happen at government-built bridges.
The water we drink doesn't make us sick.
Yeah, that's right. Only government can purify water. Yes, the whole private bottled water industry is a sham.
So when government's really working well, and the programs are really working well, nothing happens. Nothing happens to us.
This implies, of course, that these bad things would happen if it weren't for these government programs. As I've mentioned previously, this can be called into doubt. There are plenty of private sector companies that build and maintain public infrastructure, provide security, healthcare, education, inspect the quality of the products we buy, protect the environment, and just about everything else government does. In fact, not only does the private sector do all the good things government does, but it doesn't do any of the bad things government does, like kidnapping people into a cage over weed, or blowing people up overseas. And I must reiterate, if government services were really better than private sector services, there'd be no need to force us to pay for them against our will.
So it's not too surprising that a lot of people fail to notice that they're getting those kinds of benefits.
It really doesn't matter what benefits we get from it, because we're forced to pay for it against their will. Even if people were fully aware of all the benefits they got from government, it's unlikely this would make them any happier about it, because if they feel what they're paying isn't worth the benefits, there's no way to opt out. In fact, a lot of government programs cause harm, like regulations increase the price of things, and the war on drugs throws innocent people in jail. So greater public awareness of how tax money is being used would more likely create more dissent toward taxation, not less.
Government is the way that we band together as citizens to solve problems that we could possibly solve as individuals.
Is government the only way to do that, though? I mean, in the private sector, we see countless examples of charities and nonprofit organizations, people doing exactly what Professor Amy described, concerned citizens coming together to tackle problems too big for any one individual to deal with. And they all manage to accomplish this without resorting to violence or coercion.
Are not going to be solved through the market.
Well, the market doesn't solve problems. The market isn't a person, but a framework within which people interact. Now, what the market does do is incentivize people to solve problems. Whenever there's a problem, that creates demand for a solution, and a potential for someone to profit by providing a solution. If the market isn't solving a problem, that's for one of several reasons. Either the problem can't be solved, in which case the government wouldn't really be able to do anything either, or it's either not actually a problem, or a problem that's not serious enough for people to be voluntarily willing to contribute money toward a solution. So in that case, if the government stepped in and forced people to pay for that problem, that would be diverting resources away from dealing with a problem that's bigger or more serious.
So we need government to do things like clean up the environment.
Countries that are more economically free typically have a better environment. This is because the free market encourages efficient resource use, and having private property makes it easier to protect you against pollution. For example, it used to be the case that once crude oil was refined into gasoline, anything left over was dumped into the water, but people found ways to reuse the leftovers. Now we have asphalt, plastic, rubber, etc. And because the economies are stronger in these types of countries, there's more resources for people to start, environmental nonprofits or environmental activist groups to do things like to go out on the weekends, pick up trash along the side of the roads, out in the woods, or go out in the canoe and fish trash out of the water. Heck, I used to volunteer with organizations that did this type of work.
To ensure that the elderly have enough health care.
There are private sector organizations that have been doing this long before the government. And unlike Social Security and Medicare, they're actually more economically stable.
To combat crime.
Not only does private security on average do a better job at reducing crime and for a lower cost, but the Supreme Court said in District of Columbia versus Warren that the police actually have no obligation to stop crime.
Pursue justice. All these kinds of things. And the problem is that if we keep cutting taxes and trying to shrink government, that what we're going to do really is undermine our ability as a society to make the world into a better place.
I would actually argue that government undermines our ability to come together as a society and make the world a better place. Do you remember all those private sector businesses and organizations I mentioned that are out there solving all these problems? How much more effective do you think they would be if they weren't being hampered by regulations? How much more could we accomplish if we were free to decide how to spend our own money? What if instead of relying on a bloated and corrupt bureaucratic machinery, we as a society came together and did stuff about these problems? All this time, money, and energy is spent campaigning for pro-welfare politicians could have probably built several homeless shelters. I think it would be rather fitting to conclude this video by introducing you to a book that, in my opinion, is far more worth your time and money.